Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, ciao, bonjour, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hey, my name is Jedley. Welcome to Reading with Your Kids. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville, located in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so very happy and absolutely honored that you're joining us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. We do that by sharing fun, thoughtful, and thought-provoking conversations with fascinating people who just happen to be writing books for kids of all ages. You can join us in this mission by telling all of your family and friends about the show and letting them know that they can hear us on the WREB AM/FM 24/7 radio network, and they can find us on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Good Pods, Apple Podcasts, CastBox, Player FM, Amazon Music, Audible, wherever you find your favorite shows. Wonderful show lined up for you today. Katherine Marsh is here to celebrate her new middle grade novel. It's called The Myth of Monsters, The God's Revenge. And later in the show, we will be taking a listen back to our conversation with Rachel Sarah celebrating Girl Warriors. Hey, parents, grandparents, caregivers, and teachers, are you looking for a fun way to teach important values to your kids? Check out Timothy'sLessons.com.
It's Timothy's lessons. Timothy's lessons in good values. It's Timothy's lessons. Timothy's lessons in good values. Teaching life lessons to his friends. It's Timothy's lessons. Forward thinking activities. It's Timothy's lessons. Building confidence and mental strength. It's Timothy's lessons. Timothy's lessons in good values. It's Timothy's lessons. Timothy's lessons in good values. Wonderful fun sing-along songs. It's Timothy's lessons. Important lessons on key values. It's Timothy's lessons. Children's books and uplifting stories. It's Timothy's lessons. Timothy's lessons in good values. It's Timothy's lessons. Timothy's lessons in good values.
Check it out today, Timothy'sLessons.com. Hey, my friends, here's something to think about. What if mistakes weren't something to fear, but something to celebrate? In It's Okay Not to Know by Brenda Doe, young readers meet Bink, a lovable little monster who worries they're not good enough when they struggle or make mistakes. But then, Bink discovers a powerful truth. Every uh-oh is an opportunity. Every question is a chance to grow. And every child deserves to know perfection isn't what makes you special. Curiosity, courage, and self-love do. A must-read for parents, teachers, and anyone who wants to help kids build resilience and confidence. Get your copy of It's Okay Not to Know by Brenda Doe today, because learning begins when we stop fearing the unknown. Joining us right now to celebrate her brand new middle grade novel, it's called The Myth of Monsters, The God's Revenge. Please welcome back to Reading with Your Kids, Katherine Marsh. Hey, Katherine, how are you?
Great. Thank you so much for having me back, Jen.
Great to see you again. I love the spirit and the energy that I find in your books. This, you know, the imagining the myths, the gods, and these different worlds that kind of run parallel to ours. And I am thinking that is what I loved when I was in middle school.
Well, I think this is a great topic because so many of the kids already know Greek mythology through school programs. It's part of the Common Core, and of course through Rick Riordan's books, which really have introduced a lot of the mythology to this generation. But they're hungry for more stories. And what I wanted to do with this series was to combine some of the issues that kids normally have in their mortal middle schools, things like friendships and fairness and, social dynamics with all of these wonderful myths.
Yeah. That, boy, when you think about it, as adults, we always complain, oh, we got to pay the bills, got to do the job, got to fix that and this. But boy, kids in school dealing with friendships and, learning about all the new things. I remember my son in middle school, all of his kids, all of his friends, they seem to desperately want no one to know that they didn't know anything. They tried so hard to prove that they knew everything. It was really obvious to me that none of them knew anything.
Well, it's interesting because, my book is about the descendants of the Greek mythological monsters. And Rick, of course, did his book about the descendants of the gods, kids who are demigods. But when I think of middle school and what it was like for me, I felt a lot more like a monster than a god because your body is changing. You feel like an outsider. There's lots of issues of belonging. And so I felt that these stories of the monsters and their origins were a wonderful way to explore some of the social issues of being a middle schooler. And that's why I thought it was just a great series, for kids who are getting into that age of 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade.
Yeah. Have you always been a fan of Greek mythology?
Always, always. I remember the D'Aulaire's book. I don't know if you ever read that as a kid, but it was this wonderful book by a couple, the D'Aulaire's, who did both. They adapted the myths for kids and they had wonderful illustrations. And that was my introduction to the Greek myths. And then I just went wild with them. I studied Latin for a few years. And I really love these stories. I always have. So it's been a pleasure to delve into them and to bring new meaning to them for this generation too.
Boy, Latin, that brings up a painful memory for me. I attended a Jesuit high school, but before that, I attended a very progressive public school where they would try new educational theories. And I wasn't aware of that in my progressive elementary school, they didn't teach us English grammar. They taught us how to write, and I could write very well, but I got to this traditional Jesuit high school and taking Latin. And about halfway through the year, my grades were terrible, and I was working so hard. And this wonderful old Jesuit priest, Father John Waterbury Kelly, he called my mother in, had a meeting with both of us, and he said, I know what his problem, he vocabulary is great. He works really well. He knows it. He doesn't know the grammar, and he's never going to get it because you didn't teach. So I need you to drop the class. I'll give you a passing grade if you just drop out. Otherwise, I'm going to have to flunk you. And I said, I can bail out of this, Father Kelly. No problem at all. And he took good care of me, and he became a very important person in my life. But never again as a teacher. Never again as a classic teacher, but definitely a mentor. So.
Right.
That was sorry for that kind of sidetrack, but I got to give my.
It's an interesting story. Yeah.
So what is it about mythology that really hooked you and hooked so many kids?
I think it's because these stories just resonate across the ages. I mean, they're about very fundamental things like death and love and, heroism. I do think that they have the slant of the times that they were, written in, and they've been rewritten over and over. And I think that's something that I really wanted to play with as a writer. It's been done by a lot of adult fiction writers over the last 5 to 10 years. But I was really interested in, there are always multiple versions of the story with many of these myths. And, I think thinking about that and why there are these different versions and what they mean and where they come from is really something that I think is a great exercise for kids in terms of developing their own kind of analytical, critical skills. And beyond that, they're just fun and creative and weird. And I love how weird, I talk about this story of Zeus and his first wife, Medusa, who she turned herself into a fly because they were having a competition about, who could turn into something more interesting. And then he, used that to trick her and swallow her. And that is why the goddess Athena was born out of his head. That is the weirdest family, right? And I feel like if you have anything in your life where you feel a little maybe not normal and you read Greek mythology and you're like, well, at least my mother wasn't a fly, And kids really love that because it's so creative, those stories. They're really creative. And so I love working with that as my foundational material.
Boy, what a story. You have to wonder what the person who created those stories was ingesting.
Well, and then the other thing is that they were really changed. The Greeks had versions, the Romans had versions. There were versions that actually came later. I mean, that people have adapted since then. And that's something when I go to schools, I talk to kids about all the ways that the myths can be played with and adapted. Yeah. And, we can bring our own creativity and our own sort of culture and our own values to them and really, be playful. And I think that's a great learning exercise for kids.
I think that's a great way to get kids interested in writing is to take characters that already exist in our culture and let them play with it.
That's right. I mean, we call it fan fiction now, but there's a real argument that a lot of literature is fan fiction. It's somebody responding, sometimes not overtly, but to another work and sort of having a conversation. And so this is something I think Greek myths is a wonderful kind of first step for, with Medusa, I have third graders and fourth graders, even second graders who love this material, know this material, and it gives them their first sense of, how literature is developed, how it changes, how stories are told differently. It gives them a foundation for taking these characters and making their own stories out of them. And that's something I also encourage when I do school visits is how would you take a character, a villain, a hero, a heroine, somebody who's a minor character and turn them into, the subject of a story.
Yeah. I'm curious. We've talked here on Reading with Your Kids about how watered down, I don't know if that's the word, like fairy tales. Like you take a fairy tale today and compare it to the original Grimm fairy tales, and it's nothing.
Right.
Like, the Grimms are really grim.
They're grim.
And dark. And has that happened a lot with the Greek mythology?
It's interesting because a lot of the Greek myths, I mean, they deal with some very mature issues. They deal with adultery. They deal with, sex and violence. And I always feel as a middle grade author that there are ways to discuss topics that are age appropriate. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that, because I'm also a parent, I'm not just a writer, I'm sensitive to, and I think about the way that I would want my own children to learn about these issues. But in terms of things being watered down, it's really interesting because, I think Americans like happy endings. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that we're kind of primed to do with a lot of fairy tales and myths, is to try to figure out the happy ending. And a lot of these tales originally were quite dark, as you point out, particularly with the Grimm's tales, but, even with the myths. Mm-hmm. And I think it is interesting. I don't try to water them down. I would say that what I try to do is to, especially with the Medusa series, is to look at other characters' perspectives mm-hmm. that might not have been the focus, because obviously our stories represent who we are. And mm-hmm. the ancient Greeks had certain values and certain ideas, including of women and girls, that are kind of built into those stories. And I think it's a useful exercise to, also have kids think about that. Like, where do stories come from? How do they reflect who we are? And looking at all these different periods of history. Mm-hmm. So, that's what I try to do when I rewrite a fairy tale or a myth. Mm-hmm. It's less to kind of sanitize it or make it sort of more of a happy ending, but it's a little bit more to sort of play around, especially with this series, which is set in the contemporary world, with some of the different ways that we see ourselves today, while still enjoying very much that foundational material.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had we created a series here on Reading with Your Kids of interviews with Latin American authors, and it's a great series in Spanish. But one of the things that came from that series is that there's a lot less of that needing to have a happy ending in books written for kids in Latin America. And we were just speaking with an author here in the States whose editor, who wrote a book with a happy ending, and the editor said, let's make the main character lose in the end. And so I'm wondering if we're going to see less and less of that, and if our kids' stories might become more, I don't know, realistic or more in line with, what we experience every day.
It's so interesting you say that, because I'm thinking of the very first book I wrote, which was actually a Greek mythology-based book. It was a retelling of the Orpheus and Eurydice story, and it won the Edgar Award for Best Juvenile Mystery. Now, that book, The Night Tourist, when I first wrote it, I created a happy ending, and my editor saw it and said, well, because the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, the kind of idea of it is that you cannot bring people back. And I really, really wanted to, and I had an early version of that where I did, and I think I would have satisfied a lot of kids with that, but I also felt that I was somehow being dishonest in terms of understanding a little more about life. And that was for older middle grade readers, and I felt that that was appropriate. With the Medusa series, which runs a little younger, it goes really 7 through, 13, I also understand the need, particularly in this time in our lives in history, that kids do need stuff that's fun and escapist and I believe childhood, when possible, should be filled with a lot of joy and imagination. And so I really, this is something that's an internal struggle for me, because it depends somewhat on the age of the readers. It depends on sort of, a certain type of honesty or, that I feel is important. Like, you don't want to have a happy ending that's totally unrealistic, doesn't make sense, even for a fantasy world. But I also think, particularly with young readers, they deserve to have some joy and some sense of magic and all of that. So I think it's a wonderful discussion to have. And I think everybody works through that in different ways. And, for parents, that's something that you also want to be thinking about. And I think you can select books that maybe are more kind of, gentle, or a little bit more have a sense of reality. And your readers may help guide you with that too, what they need.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned being a parent and being sensitive to parents a number of times. We really love encouraging parents of older kids to continue to read with them or co-read with them, because it's so very valuable. What kind of conversations do you think families can have as they're reading The God's Revenge together?
Oh, this is such a great question. I'm so passionate about this topic because, Jed, I wrote a piece, I think we may have talked about this last time, in the Atlantic, about middle graders and reading falling off and why they're not reading. And I think we talked about this a little last time, but I continue to feel very passionate on this subject. And, and I've seen over the 18 years I've been writing for middle grade readers a decline. And so I'm really sensitive to this, both as an author, because this is my livelihood. I want to continue doing it, and as a parent. And, I think that reading aloud with kids, whether it's in a classroom or a home setting, is vital. Mm-hmm. I really think it is. And I also think having your kids read to you is vital, because, I think we've again talked about this, but reading aloud, your kids reading aloud, is also a way for you to sort of like make sure, help them with their reading skills, and, or reading side by side, which is another thing, is getting 2 copies of the book, always great for me, and then reading maybe separately, but then talking about each chapter together when you're done and discussing it. And those are things that really build reading skills. And with The God's Revenge, there is a lot to talk about in terms of kids that are, in that kind of 8 to 12, 13 age range, particularly in this book. I'll give away just a little bit. But Ava, who is the central character, she's the descendant of Medusa. One of her very good friends comes back after the summer and has turned, her friend is a descendant of an impusa, which is a Greek kind of vampire, and she has the power of transformation. So over the summer, she's figured out how to make herself look fabulous. And Ava has very complicated feelings about that, and it changes the social dynamic for the friends. And, this is something that happens a lot with girls, especially, and boys, and everyone. And, as they go through puberty, they change. People grow at different rates, and it sometimes can create sort of, divisions or tension or jealousy or, all these different things that can happen. And so that was one thing. And the other thing I was really interested in exploring in this book is, and this is something which is true of the whole series, is I really want this series to be a stepping stone for particularly mothers and daughters to talk about being a girl and a woman, and what the sort of, what their hopes and dreams are, what are things they need to be aware of. There's a lot of, this idea that, that is embedded in some of these myths and fairy tales, that wanting too much is not a good thing. And I really wanted to kind of explore that in this book. The idea that it's okay to want a lot of things. It's okay to be out there and to kind of have a voice. That's one of the things I would love, and have heard this to be true with Medusa, by the way, where parents, particularly mothers and daughters, have discussed some of those themes. And then I'm also the parent of a son as well as a daughter. So I'm really interested in, also, I have some, the male characters in this book I really thought about a lot. They're very important. And I wanted to also have boys and men explore kind of, their relationship to the women and girls in their lives. So it's a way to do all of that, and just to have fun too. I think this is a very funny book as well.
Awesome. Yeah, those are some pretty heavy conversations that you're suggesting, and it is so much easier to talk about that in the context of discussing characters and what's going on in a book, as opposed to let's sit down and have this important talk.
Yes. My children, whenever I have, I'm a parent, and all parents are human. We all kind of make mistakes. And I know I have done that with my kids, of like, I really want to talk about this. And they're like, oh, Mom, you're so cringy. Mm-hmm. But you know what? When you read a story, and especially a story that's fun and exciting, and that's where fantasy is also a great way to talk about some of these things without being so overt, or heavy about it. And so, I think a book like Medusa, the Medusa series, or God's Revenge, gives you an opportunity to be like, like, I remember when I was that age, and, like, I was smaller than everyone else, and how did I feel about that? And like, how did it shape me? And like, how can you think about yourself and these perceptions, and it's a lot more, I think, it's just a much warmer, sort of more fun way to have some of these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. You talked about changes that kids go through in this age group. And I remember, my son was starting middle school at one particular school, and he was a tiny guy, and the kids in the class a couple of kids especially weren't especially kind to him. That school closed, and my son went to a different school, in a different town, and he really had this huge growth spurt. Just out of nowhere. He went from being a tiny guy to towering over me. And he and I were walking down the street one day, and we encountered these kids who weren't all that kind to him as a young guy, and they hadn't grown at all. And suddenly they looked at him with terror.
Right. No, it's absolutely. And the other thing I think too is that because we live in this kind of Instagram, like social media culture, and this is particularly true with girls, I think, is that they get the sense that certain people are perfect. They look perfect, their lives are perfect. And that's something that happened even before social media. But this book really challenges them to think about that, because I think appearances sometimes can be deceptive. And I also think that there are a lot of girls who, may seem to their peers like they have everything and are struggling themselves. And I think that sort of, changing the conversation a little bit about that is really important and brings a lot of compassion to the table as well.
Is there a myth out there that you are really looking forward to playing with?
Well, there's so many. I have to say, like, I've been, putting together my, next book for the series ideas, and there's so many really great ones. And I would say that, each of my characters, I have 5 main characters, two are boys, 3 are girls, and each of them is descendant from a monster that I want to kind of retell the origin story of. So, there are definitely there are 2 characters I haven't done yet that I think the kids love. One is Fia, who's the fiery descendant of a chimera, and the other one is Arnold, who is a descendant of a harpy. And I think both those stories are wonderful, and I really, really am excited to delve into that next.
Well, we definitely want you to come back to celebrate that when that's out there. Before we ask you to tell us where we can find out more about the books, what's it like? I read on your website that your books have been translated into 16 different languages. What's that like to pick up a copy that's and to see your story printed in a language that you couldn't read if there was a gun pointed at your head?
Well, I absolutely love it. And, it's not a coincidence that a lot of my books are set in international settings. The Medusa series, the school for the descendants of the Greek mythological monsters, is in Venice, and it's a city I've only been to once, but I fell in love with it, as many people do, and I knew I wanted to set a book there and also go to a magical boarding school there because that seemed to be a lot of fun. But The Lost Year, my National Book Award finalist, covers Ukraine. Nowhere Boy is a book about it's set in Belgium, which is about the European immigration crisis of 2015. And I think I always hoped my books would be translated. They've been translated into so many languages, and it brings me great joy to know that these are kind of international stories and that they're finding readers all over the world. And I really think that, I wrote these books also because I want kids to be thinking about the world and about, all the different people in it and their experiences. And so it's very gratifying to have the books, reaching readers around the world.
That's awesome. I learned about those translations existing from visiting your website. Tell people how they can go and visit your website and see all the great things that you're doing.
Absolutely. And we're doing a wonderful update with a lot of extra material, particularly for the Medusa series, for Medusa and the God's Revenge. And I'm really excited because there's going to be a Just for Kids section where kids can get on and take some quizzes about the books and about their reading and what type of things they like, because I write so many different genres, right? And so there's a book for every reader that I write. If you have a historical fiction reader, a realistic fiction, a fantasy, I have that book for them. And as they grow from, 7, 8 up to, 14 and an adult. So www.katherinemarsh.com has that information. It has a lot of wonderful teacher's guides, which actually are great for parents too, especially if they want to know more about sort of the context of the book or some of the, history or issues in it. And so that I hope is a real resource for, parents. But my books are meant to be read aloud. And I think with the Medusa series, I purposefully tried to go for the Pixar model, meaning that I tried to have just fun stories that you could read on that kind of just basic, joyful level, but then also have a depth and a humor that adults could appreciate as well.
Awesome. We've had a really great time speaking to the author of The Myth of Monsters, The God's Revenge. It's the latest book from our guest, Katherine Marsh. Katherine, thanks so much for being back with us.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Judd. Thank you.
Hey, families, would you like to share a miracle with your kids? At the Wolf Conservation Center, hope was fading. The endangered Mexican wolves dreamed of a pup, but none had come. until one tiny miracle changed everything. Meet Trumpet, a real-life wolf pup whose incredible birth brought joy, hope, and a lesson in conservation. Trumpet the Miracle Wolf, written by Leocadia George, is a heartwarming true story that will inspire your whole family. Teach your kids the power of hope, love, and protecting endangered species. Get your copy today and join the wild adventure. This episode of Reading with Your Kids is brought to you by We're Going to the Dinosaur Forest, written by Marie Nichols. Marie Nichols was recently on my Connecticut Book Festival's podcast, and what a delightful woman. One of the things she said really struck home with me. She said, parents nurture with care, siblings are taught to share, but grandparents embrace the dares. We're Going to the Dinosaur Forest is a colorful, fun-filled book where this grandmother dares to embark on a wild journey with her grandson into the dinosaur forest. It's available on Amazon. It's also available on bookshop.org. You and your kids and you and your grandkids are going to love this book. It's We're Going to the Dinosaur Forest, written by Marie Nichols. Our guest today is Rachel Sarah. She is here to celebrate her beautiful book, Girl Warriors, How 25 Young Activists Are Saving the Earth. Hey, Rachel, how are you?
Thank you so much for having me, Jed. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here as part of our Protecting the Planet with Your Kids series. I guess the first question I have to ask you is, what inspired you to write Girl Warriors?
Great question. So I grew up in the 90s really thinking that if you just do simple things like turn out your lights, you can make a big difference in the world. And while individual actions are really big, I had no words for the climate crisis growing up. Even though I grew up in the drought of California, it was just like, oh, be sure to just take a short shower. Well, then jump ahead. I'm a mom. I had my first daughter in the year 2000 as a single mom, then had another daughter 12 years later. And living back in California, the wildfires started to rage here. And this was 2018. Greta Thunberg started speaking up and telling the UN and telling the world that there's a crisis going on and we should treat it like a crisis. And she also said, you love your children above all else, and yet you're stealing their futures in front of their very eyes. And that's how I felt as a mother. I was terrified. I wanted to tell my children that we're safe, everything's going to be okay, but the smoke was so bad. Schools closed. We knew so many people who had to evacuate. And I just had to do something. So I have a journalism degree. I had pivoted for years and gone into marketing communications, and I decided I need to return to journalism, and I need to do something and need to use my skills and interview all of these young climate activists all over the world who are rising up for my future, your future, for the future of children everywhere.
Yeah. So I definitely want to find out some of these great activists that are around the world that are role models, not only for kids, but for old people like me. But first, you're a mom, and one of the things that we want to do here with this series is to give parents the information they need so that they can inspire their kids and actually be active with their kids to save the world and protect our planet. But we don't want to frighten them. So how did you approach that with your kids? How did you start talking to your kids about climate change without scaring the life out of them?
Yes. First of all, I wanted to simply acknowledge to my children and to all children, like if they go into classrooms, and I want to acknowledge, like, if you are afraid, it is okay to feel afraid. And I want you to know that I am working so hard, and everyone in your community is working so hard to make a difference and to make changes. There's still time. There's still so much that we can do. And these girls and young women who I interviewed, most of them can't even vote yet. yet they're speaking up. They're talking to their parents. They're talking to their family members. They're making phone calls to their leaders in their communities. And we know now, we know the science, we know what causes climate change, and we can build a better world. So I just really tell them, and we do journaling activities to really write down all the things that people are doing, all the things that we can do. I really want kids to feel empowered.
Yeah, absolutely. And learning about these girl warriors is certainly a great way to empower kids. I know, when you say to a kid, "Hey, you can do anything," you can grow up to be anything you want to be. It sounds good, but when you actually see a kid, a person your age or a person that's not too much older than you, actually doing something and making a difference, that really rings true to kids.
Yes,
Yeah.
it really does. It really does. And especially when, the reality is, especially as kids are getting older and becoming teenagers and in high school and in college, one of the things that surprised me while writing Girl Warriors is that these young women spoke to me so openly about their anxiety, and there's a word for it, it's eco-anxiety, just how much they struggle sometimes with just even like sleeping because they're so worried and anxious and angry. But what's amazing is that they are doing something, and they're getting their leaders to do something, and they're rising up and they're speaking up. And so they're really channeling their fears to really, to make changes. And they also reminded me as well as how important it is to take care of yourself. So spend time with your friends, go outside, go on walks, be in nature, communicate your feelings to your friends and your family and people you trust.
Yeah. I think that's that advice to get outside, especially getting outside with our kids. You protect what you love. And a great way to start, if you want to get your family involved in protecting the planet, you want to protect the planet with your kids, a great way to start is just to help your kids fall in love with the planet. And what better way to do it than to be out in nature?
Yes. Yeah. And I know, Jed, that you have kids as well. And just like that, like mama bear, papa bear instinct to like, I will do anything to protect you. Like, I love you. Like, that was really what generated for me, writing this book. It's just, I've got to do something for the future for all kids everywhere. And the seed for this book was actually a feature that I wrote for the Washington Post when, in 2018, I interviewed 4 teen climate activists. And I quickly realized that it was their parents behind them who were making this work possible. They couldn't drive yet. Their parents were driving them to the climate strikes, were helping them stay organized, follow up with emails to their congressional leaders. And it's really parents who can really get behind their kids to help them and support them.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a little warrior here when my son was in kindergarten. One of the things that stands out is one of his classmates on a drive home from school saw that a goose had been hit by a car. And it really upset him. And there was this one particular road where there were lots of geese, and he did something about it. He started writing to the mayor, and the city came by and they erected a goose crossing signs. Slow down. And I don't think there's been another goose casualty at that spot since then.
Yes. Amazing. And that is such a good example to show how speaking up, how you can change things. Another thing that on that note that the activists pointed out to me is how everything is connected. Like you said, like our system of roads, how we build things, how everything is connected to something else. So it's not just the climate crisis alone, but the climate crisis is affecting animals all over the world. It's affecting like how people of lower income in their communities, and whether what the air quality is like if they're living near a coal plant, and how just like, yeah, a simple change like putting up a sign can really help animals in our communities.
Yeah. So let's get to know a couple of these girl warriors. Why don't we start? Who was the youngest warrior that you met?
Let's see. I believe that was Lily, who lives in the Netherlands. She actually started when she was 7 years old, picking up garbage on the street with her grandpa, and they started just going on walks. And by the time that Lily was 10, 11 years old, she was speaking up all over the world about plastic pollution and what happens when we continue to make things out of plastic, and how it's affecting the ocean and it's affecting our water. And she has now become such a spokesperson about plastic pollution in the world. So yeah, she was only 7. Let's see, there's Haven Coleman, who's in Colorado. And when Haven was just in elementary school and she was in 5th grade, she started learning about what was happening to animals. One of her favorite animals is the sloth. And she started learning about the climate crisis. And she just got really fired up and asked her mom to start driving her to town hall in Denver so she could strike every Friday and sit on the steps. Well, then Haven ended up contacting Greta Thunberg and learning about what she was doing. And Haven co-founded the U.S. Youth Climate Strike and organized thousands of youth all across the United States in 2019. So these were kids who were just in elementary school who just decided to speak up.
It's really incredible when you think about that. I mean, I remember being in 5th grade, and I don't think I was thinking about saving the sloths or running a strike in front of City Hall. Yeah,
it's amazing. I also interviewed a young woman named Shreya Ramachandran, and when she was in 6th grade. She's from the same area in California where I live, and she went to India to visit her grandparents and realized like the land was so dry, just like it is in California. And after years of drought, and she saw in India like people actually struggling to get drinking water. So she came home and realized, thanks to her grandma, that if you use a different kind of soap that doesn't affect the water, you can reuse that water. It's called gray water, to like water your plants and reuse your water from your laundry and your dishes. So she founded something called the Gray Water Project when she was in middle school. And now she's taught like more than 50,000 people all over the world about gray water. She wrote a curriculum. She just started at Stanford. Now she's a freshman. And it's just been incredible to see how she was only 12 years old when she started doing this. And now, like I'm seeing in California, in my own community, they're starting to, with new buildings, to reuse the water, because this is just clean water that's coming from the mountains, but we could reuse it, to water our gardens.
Yeah. One of the things that always baffles me, and, we're hearing so much about the fires and the drought in California, and at the same time here on the East Coast, where it has literally rained almost every day since the beginning of August here in the Boston area. And it's like, why aren't we able to get the water where there's a surplus to the places where it's needed? I mean, we're able to transport oil and gas from, Canada to Mexico. Why we're not able to get water to where it needs to be?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I actually just interviewed somebody yesterday for my next climate book that I'm working on that's for teen readers. And she works in water management, and she was telling me it's about how we manage water. It's like from the top down. we need to really rethink the way that we manage our systems. Like, it's a systemic problem. We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing. And she was pointing out, we do have enough water, like you said, and we still have the resources right now. So we need to make the changes in how we're managing them. And I don't know if you've heard about this in the news, but COP26, the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, is coming up really soon. It starts at the end of October. And this is where all the world leaders will be converging in Glasgow. And they're going to be talking about these issues. How do we manage things from way up, from starting with the leaders of every country in the world, so that we can really start saving water and producing energy in a different way, that we're not relying on fossil fuels. So it's really exciting. Just this week and next week, a lot of the climate activists from Girl Warriors are starting to make their way to Europe so that they can be there at COP26. And they're really asking, they're saying, please let us have a voice. Some of the biggest polluting countries in the world have had the biggest voices and have the seats at the table every single year of this climate change conference. It's time for you to listen to us this year. Mm-hmm.
Do you think a lot of our issues around water and resources and the misuse of oil and whatnot, do you think it might stem from fear? It's like, I know we need to do something better for the world, and I know the people in California need this water, but man, if we let them have it, then we might not have it. And it sounds like we really have to change the way that we're thinking and think less about me and more about we.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. So true. It's fear. I think it's greed. A lot of it, like the fossil fuel industry has made a lot of money. I think like people are really, really afraid. Well, what would happen if I just gave up what I've been doing my whole life, my family's been doing? How would I pivot to make energy in a different way? I mean, it is scary, but youth are saying we can retrain people. We will make sure everybody has a job, because that's a lot of the fear is like, what would I do if I didn't do this job that I've been doing my whole life? So it's really exciting that in the United States we have new leaders in office, and I'm hopeful.
Getting back to the Girl Warriors that you interviewed, what was the most surprising warrior, or what was the thing that the warrior, this a particular warrior was doing that was most surprising to you?
Let's see. I had the fortune of being able to interview one of the activists named Isha Clark, because Isha is in Oakland, which is just down the road from me. And it was I heard about Isha first by seeing a video of Isha online that totally blew me away. So this video went viral. Isha was a teenager, and Isha's now at Howard University, just started there as a freshman. So Isha was in high school and interning for a group called Youth versus Apocalypse in the Bay Area, and another group of activists said, hey, do you want to come? We're going to California Senator Dianne Feinstein's office. We're going to deliver a letter to Feinstein and ask Feinstein to please vote yes on the Green New Deal, which is a proposal that for leaders to tackle climate change in the United States. Well, Isha went with this group of kids and showed up at the office, and they were all really surprised because Feinstein came down the stairs to talk to them. Well, Isha approached Feinstein very politely and said, it's so nice to meet you. I really want to talk to you about how the U.S. might be able to produce energy in a different way without emitting fossil fuels. And Feinstein got so angry and so defensive, and Feinstein said, I've been doing this work for 30 years. You can't come in here and tell me what to do. You can't tell me that it has to be my way or the highway. I'm not going to talk to you. Isha just listened Isha was so calm, and Isha said, I hear what you're saying. And I am listening to you. I understand what your job is. I'm asking you to please also listen to us. And it was incredible. Isha was like not intimidated, calmly spoke. This video went viral because it just showed how Isha spoke in such a clear, calm, brave way to this leader who's been in office for decades. And it really made quite a splash on social media because so many people were taken by Isha.
Yeah, what a great role model for Senator Feinstein.
Yes.
I'm really surprised to hear that a politician would react that way, especially in public with cameras.
I know.
Boy, we always talk about, the conversations that families can have as they're reading books together. And we encourage families to continue to read with their kids long after they're able to read together because, your third grader Girl Warriors might not be something your third graders will be able to read on their own right away, but they can certainly read it with you. And if you're taking turns reading Girl Warriors and finding out about these incredible young women who are making a difference and inspiring, and just turning to your daughter at one point and saying, you could do this too.
Yeah.
What an empowering experience that could be.
It really is. Yeah. My youngest is in 4th grade, and it's been really sweet. She's been asking me to read Girl Warriors with her at night. She has made some grammatical corrections. and they're true. I told her she should have edited the manuscript. But it's amazing because before COVID hit, she went to so many climate strikes with me, so she recognizes some of the young women in the book. Oh, I remember Sarah Goody. I remember, and then she's seen me because I wrote the book during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So she would walk in, like sometimes while I was interviewing, because I was homeschooling her at the same time. So she'd say, oh, I know Daphne in New York City. And yeah, it's so great because she's seen what these young women are doing.
Yeah. Does your daughter have a favorite warrior?
Yes, I would say that Daphne Frias is probably her favorite because I've chatted with Daphne so many times and have ended up interviewing Daphne for so many stories after I wrote Girl Warriors. So Daphne is in New York City and is an incredible Latinx climate activist. Her family's from the Dominican Republic. Daphne was also born with cerebral palsy and gets everywhere in a wheelchair. Daphne's headed right now to COP26 in Glasgow. And Daphne has become such a leader in her community in West Harlem. She actually ran.
This episode of Reading with Your Kids is brought to you by We're Going to the Dinosaur Forest, written by Marie Nichols.
All women who are just making sure that people in her community get basic resources like food. And Daphne is in medical school to become a medical doctor because Daphne has pointed out to me that public health is completely connected to the climate crisis. It is affecting people's health. And so she is just a powerhouse and incredible.
Rachel, tell everybody, please, where they can find out more about you and where they can find out more about Girl Warriors.
Yeah, so I'm all over social media. So if you just look for Rachel Sarah, you'll find me on Twitter and you'll find me on Instagram. And that's the best place to connect with me. Also, my website is my name, rachelsarah.com. And I love communicating with parents and young people. So send me a message.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Reading with Your Kids. We hope that inspires you to join us for the next exciting episode of the show. Hey, if you've had fun listening to this show, please consider leaving a review on whatever platform you found us on. And also, please consider sharing the link to this show with a friend, somebody you think would enjoy it. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful, starting with our guest, Katherine Marsh. Please be sure to check out The Myth of Monsters, The God's Revenge. I also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place. And you do that every time you read with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next episode of Reading with Your Kids.